I would like to welcome everybody to today's talk with Dr. Stuart Kendall, and he's clutching a copy of his new book.
It's true.
A Journey to Mexico, Letters of Antonin Artaud, which I think is going to be a fascinating journey. Artaud is such an interesting person anyway, but this one particular escapade, as it were, has its own particular magic, doesn't it?
Yes.
I think Stuart's going to take us somewhere maybe we've never been before. It should be quite a ride. So thank you, Stuart. Thanks for agreeing to be here today.
Well, thanks everyone for coming out. And I don't know what what brought you here today.
Joanne told me about it.
It was her week. I've heard it was.
Danny told me and he owns this.
I'm responsible.
So you're
Excellent.
fault.
Good. Excellent. I'm glad we've ascertained at least that. That's maybe the only fact that we
For
can.
me, it was the Mexicans and the hallucinogens.
All right. So we'll definitely get to that topic. But so what brings me here today is this book that, as John says, I recently. So it's a book of Artaud's writings from or about his journey to Mexico. So I normally write about the French philosopher Georges Bataille and the sort of post-surrealist aesthetic experience. So if anyone is interested in Bataille, we can also talk about that. But this particular project, it's been in my mind for a little while because it's not come into translation yet, which is quite surprising. You know, Artaud died like 76 years ago, and this is a key moment in his life, and he's quite a known figure. So we can say a little bit more about that. But it remains, nevertheless, this thing that we're fascinated with. We've heard about this guy, this journey, but it's kind of only now that it's here. Nevertheless, so I'm gonna try to focus on that because I find it to be a key point of interest. But if we want to talk about kind of anything in regard to Artaud or surrealism or the arts, I'm game to go there. Is basically what I'm saying. So the point to this right now, or what I'm going to try and do, is say a few things about the book, about Artaud, about Mexico, about the peyote, and then we can just talk and see where it takes us. I'm not thinking of this as a very formal thing. So if anybody wants to just interrupt and say, hey, please do so. Now, all that in mind, who are we talking about? Antonin Artaud is a French actor, dramatic theorist. He's most famous for a book called The Theater and Its Double, which is a sort of core text in the theory of what theater is and what it can be. Arguably one of the two most important books about the theater that was written in the 20th century. So he's a tremendously influential figure. He was a member of the Surrealist group, briefly, so people often associate him with that. He's a poet, and so some people would argue that Artaud is primarily a poet, and that his poetry is more important than his work in the theater, which is, for others, quite an astonishing claim. Main point of this sort of intro is to say that we can think of this guy as kind of many different figures in one. He appeals to certain people interested in one thing and other people interested in another thing. People think of him as an artist, people think of him as an actor, people think of him as a writer. We have a collection of his drawings that he did toward the end of his life here that have been exhibited in galleries and museums around the world. So for some people he's a visual artist. They would probably not even say primarily, but he touches all of these things, and some people are quite partisan for him in each of these areas. Nevertheless, what I think is interesting about this particular collection, this Journey to Mexico book, is that he set all of that work aside in 1935 through frustration and failure. He went to Mexico trying to find a way to change the world. So this is an avant-garde gesture on his part, not just to make a new kind of theater, which is what he'd been doing up to then, or write a new kind of poem, which he'd been struggling to do, but to actually change the world and change the way that people live in it. And what he was interested in was what he called creating or finding a true and vital culture. So what the hell does that phrase mean? A true and vital culture. And why did he have to go to Mexico to find that thing? That's the substance of this kind of inquiry. Like, why go so far from home? Travel from France to Mexico in search of a true and vital culture, whatever this means.
Can I ask, what year did he go to Mexico? When was that?
When did this happen?
Yeah.
He went in 1935. He went actually in January of 1936, but he started planning this trip in 1935. And the thing that sort of catalyzed it was the failure of a theater production that he put on in May of 1935. And at this moment, too, in the 1930s, and at that moment in particular, there was a tremendous movement to engage with the force and power of communism, and then on the other side to combat fascism. So you have these two, tremendous forces in shaping the intellectual climate of the moment. And then you have this group of intellectuals in France that are trying to find alternatives to either capitalism on the one hand, communism, on another hand, and then the third hand, obviously, fascism. So what do? How do we combat those kinds of things? That's the moment when Artaud says, I've got to go somewhere else, I've got to find another culture, I've got to find another way to do things. So he departs for Mexico in January 1936. This is the exact same moment that, for those of you that might be interested in Georges Bataille, he started the secret society Asafal at that moment. So people are looking for alternatives to both capitalism, to capitalism, communism, and fascism, trying to find a new way to live. For Artaud, it's got to do with this notion of connecting with the soil of a place, the sun and the cosmic cycles, and a kind of culture, a way of living, rituals, which for him, he wanted to deal with those rituals in a theatrical context, but to get beyond theater. So it's a culture of a place and a world that he was seeking in Mexico. So it's a very strange moment, right? It's a political gesture, it's a social gesture, it's a cultural gesture, it's an artistic gesture that he's trying to achieve in this moment. And so what he does is he writes a few preparatory statements that he publishes. He tries to find some funding. He fails to do all this. I think I should also mention, somewhat in anticipation of the peyote remarks that we need to get to, but Artaud had some other things in addition to his artistic endeavors that shaped his life. One of them was that he was addicted to opiates for most of his adult life. He'd been prescribed opium as a way to deal with his neurasthenia and his psychological disorders early on, and he became addicted. And of course, Artaud is also famous, for those who know him, for the almost 9 years that he spent in a mental institution, which was after his trip to Mexico. So, what's that?
After the peyote.
After the peyote,
What,
exactly.
just after or what?
Well,
Yeah,
We'll find out.
yeah, exactly. That's where we're going.
Okay.
So those stories about his life, the fact that he is a drug addict, the fact that he spent years in a mental institution, those stories often overwhelm his artistic achievements and the story of this trip to Mexico. So trying to figure out how all this fits together is kind of what we're interested in here today.
Could
in any
you,
case-
could you just, sorry to leap in, could you just tell us a little bit about this catastrophe that happened that preempted the
Why did
trip?
he go?
Yeah, the theatrical catastrophe in the previous year.
Well, so Artaud was a very successful actor and theatrical theorist in the 1920s and early 1930s. He was in two of the most famous films of the era, Abel Gance's Napoleon, 1927, and Carl Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc in 1928. So he was a well-known figure, and his essays were published in the Nouvelle Revue Française and other places. So he was kind of gathering this stuff, and yet at the same time struggling to make money and pull it all together, and to mount or create a theater of his own that was going to do everything that he dreamed that theater could be. So he's writing the manifestos that go into the theater, and it's double. He does manage to scrape money together through his film work and other things to put together a show called The Sancy, which is a story from Percy Shelley and Stendhal, which he mounts as a stage production. It's not the full dream of the theater that he hopes to have, but he puts it on in May of 1935. And the reviews are mixed. Some people think that it's a fantastic show. The costumes are by Balthus. He had some other well-known actors that were involved in it that are mostly forgotten to us now. But the show only runs for 17 productions, or 17 shows. So it's effectively a failure. He can't keep going. So it's a very strange moment and an extremely disappointing moment for him. He thought that could be the thing that would help him to get to the next place, but it fails. And at that same moment, we have this, as I was saying, this turn towards thinking about cultural activism in a different way. So he has failed theater, struggled writing, and a turn towards cultural activism. And he says, I gotta get out of here. I gotta do something else. He writes a letter, which is in this book, to his friend Jean Paulin, which says that I need to have my book of theatrical manifestos come out to put an end to my literary endeavors, which I think is a very important statement. He wants to move past art and become something else, do some other kind of thing. So he's taking a lot on this journey to Mexico. It's not about being a poet anymore, or being an artist, or being an actor. At that point, he was so disappointed in the failure of his theater, and pretty much everything that was going on, his time in the Surrealist group, all these kinds of things. So it's quite a desperate moment, and his desperation comes across in all the letters that are in this book and his manifestos at that moment. It's almost, I'm gonna fail to evoke it, but I think here we are in an art gallery, and art means a great deal to art makers and the rest of us. But here we're trying to figure out something. For Artaud, it's about art, like his life, but it's also about a search for meaning that transcends any given art form. For him, there's a metaphysical attempt to live in a meaningful way, and the failure to find that meaning is what causes him to turn to opiates. He says this often. He's looking for a deeper, more satisfying connection to things. So it's quite a desperate gesture in the spring of 1936. He goes to Mexico. He had a few letters of introduction that help him make some friends, that help him, get him through the door at some newspapers, and he manages to organize a few lectures that he can give, and he gets paid for these lectures. He publishes the results in newspapers. He writes newspaper articles, and this is how he lives. On the boat trip over there, he managed to kick his opium addiction, over those few weeks. But for him, it's always, you know, I get off, I get back on. So he arrives clean, and he's, you know, seems to be going well, but it doesn't stay that way. So it becomes, again, a quite desperate moment for him, physically, financially, psychologically. But even more strange, and this is another sort of layer as we get into this notion. So Artaud left Europe, right? And he says, he didn't just leave Europe, he fled Europe. He was trying to leave European, you know, modern European intellectual life, modern European civilization. He was trying to leave it all behind. He's trying to find an entirely new kind of culture. And he thought that was going to be rooted in the indigenous civilization of Mexico, which is quite extraordinary. But of course he arrives in Mexico, and he's greeted as the kind of conquering French hero, you know, member of the Surrealist group, a person who can testify to all the things that were going on in Europe at that time. He goes to Mexico trying to be a guy leaving Europe, finding something in Mexico, but in fact, he's greeted as someone who's bringing Europe to Mexico. And this is, I mean, again, very extraordinary and ironic, just so deeply ironic. That he should be trying to, you know, to leave Europe behind, and then that everyone should have nothing but questions for him about that. And this is a thing that we see also in this book, in the section called Revolutionary Messages, which is the collection of newspaper articles and lectures that he gave. You know, Artaud is there trying to investigate indigenous civilization in Mexico, and it turns out that you know, people in Mexico are not keen on indigenous civilization in Mexico. The artists and intellectuals in Mexico were more interested in what was happening in Europe. And we see that in the kinds of things that Artaud is interested in writing about, or is asked to write about. And it's a bit, you know, this is a complicated and delicate kind of question, because you have artists and intellectuals in Mexico in, you know, 1936 that are doing things like turning to their own heritage, the indigenous civilization, and recuperating, gathering those symbols and narratives to put into their art. And so if you think of someone like Diego Rivera, for example, you know, the Mexican muralists, their work is filled with, you know, the symbols, signs, narratives of indigenous civilization. For Artaud, looking at those paintings, however, what he sees is modern Mexico. He sees Mexican intellectuals who are trying to be Marxists, who are trying to be Europeans, but with Mexican content. And for him, this is not at all a fulfillment of what he has in mind. What he wants to do is get out of the modern era and get into something else entirely. So this raises a really, I think, you know, powerful kind of a question. You know, whose symbols are they? And what should we be looking for? You know, Artaud went to Mexico looking for indigenous civilization, but he didn't visit any archaeological sites. That's not what he was there for. He was there for living culture. He wanted to find something that is alive. And when he went into the studios of Mexican artists, you know, like Rivera, he found what he thought was effectively European concerns with Mexican content. So how do we transcend our civilization is the, you know, the kind of question that is at stake here. Can we just simply put on a new set of symbols? Can we borrow somebody else's symbols? How do we connect with, you know, this notion of a living culture? Is that all just ridiculous? And these are the kind of questions that I'm interested in asking. Who can speak for these things? You know, and just how hard is it to do so? Well, so Artaud in Mexico, he's disappointed. Obviously, he was so disappointed that he left Europe. He's disappointed in Mexico City because people keep asking him to give lectures on stuff that he doesn't want to talk about, to be a representative of something that he detests, that he thinks is a failure. He sees people who have access to something he believes, but he sees them doing what he thinks is the wrong thing with that material, trying to be modern. So shortly, he conceives of this notion of leaving Mexico City, which is where he had been based, and traveling up into the mountains, into the Sierra Tarahumara, which is in northern Mexico, so that he can get away from modernity, so he can get away from the urban, the modern, the socialist and Marxist Mexico, which was the Mexico of the intellectuals that he was amongst at that time. So it's quite
How
a...
long was he in Mexico City for then? How long was that period where he was?
We don't exactly know. He arrived there February 2nd, and he left sometime in August. So it's quite some time. He's then spent about 8 weeks among the Tarahumara, but here again, we don't really know. The further we get that he gets off the beaten track, the less we know for sure. And that's another thing that's compelling about this story, is that we just don't really know. Eventually he does he gathers the money to travel into the mountains. Why did he go to visit the Tarahumara particularly? It's hard to say. There's some speculation that, or an argument that I think is a pretty compelling one, that he read a poem by Alfonso Reyes that mentions the Tarahumara and mentions peyote. And this poem was published in France in 1929. So he could have read that as part of his the things that were feeding into his dream of going to Mexico. We can talk about that. There are other things. This is possible. It's not entirely sure. None of the documents that he prepared prior to his journey say that he wants to go there to take peyote. They just say he wants to go and connect with a living and vital civilization. So, did he go to Mexico specifically to go to the remote region and experience this? That is unlikely. But as he gets into Mexico City, that becomes the thing that he is going to do. Now, does he necessarily intend to take, is it a peyote trip that he is interested in? It's pretty unlikely that that's what it was. It seems as though what he wanted to do was just simply get away from modernity. So get up into the mountains and get into, or as close to, a civilization. Here I'm saying civilization to reference the Tarahumara. To get outside of modernity. He wanted the oldest form of indigenous culture that he could find. And so that's what took him up there. But again, he's not a great guy for this job. Who should go? Who is prepared for undertaking this kind of a journey? Certainly not Antonin Artaud. He's once again addicted to opiates. He's a physically broken man. He has no financial resources. He does not speak Spanish.
Was he alone, completely on his own?
Yes, he made friends,
Yeah.
personable guy, a good-looking man in his early life. But, at that point, totally alone. So he travels to Chihuahua by train. He's most likely able to pick up a guide who's a mestizo who will speak Tarahumara, but Artaud does not speak Spanish. So what kind of communication is possible at this point? How could he communicate in any way?
Maybe he didn't want to communicate.
Yeah, I know. So this is there's some bits of this. There's a story that there's a story told by one person reporting all this, that there was a mission to teach children in the isolated regions, that they wanted to teach them poetry and, theater arts and this kind of thing. And that the only person who was successful in getting them to pay any attention was a Frenchman who came and mesmerized them with his voice. And maybe that's the actor Antonin Artaud, who went up into the mountains. This is a story. Is that true? Seems very unlikely. But as we get up into the mountains, and then as the years pass, as his journey takes him into the mountains, and as the years pass after that, more and more weird stories come around as to what may or may not have happened. In any case, he spends about 8 weeks among the Tarahumara.
Sorry, how old is he?
How old is he at this time?
Yeah, when he goes into the mountains.
Yeah, so it's 1936, so he would have been, he's 40.
40.
Yeah. So, but a physically broken man. Yeah. So, yes. He famously...
Do we have a photograph of her?
We do not. Oh, this is a photograph of him from a few years later. He was a great-looking man. See good early photos. Oh, here's some. And maybe we'll pass this around. So if you look at this photograph of him from 1918, when he's 22 years old, I'll pass it around. You can see he's a killer. Just like great looking guy.
Film star.
Yeah.
Film star looks.
And then this is him a few years after his return. So still got it, but then this is him years later. So after you spend 8 years and 8 months in mental institutions in France during World War II, when the Nazis wanted to kill everyone and gave them starvation diets, he'd already been an addict for years. His teeth had been softened by his drug addiction, so he lost all his teeth. It looks pretty terrible. But we'll just send it around and people can glory at the ravages of time. Right.
Come here. Sit down.
That's totally so the story is that Artaud ends up in the Sierra Tarahumara. The way that he tells it, he stayed with a school teacher, and he had this guide so that he was able to hear some stories and win their trust so that he could then participate in an indigenous rite. He claims to have participated in a peyote rite, and he writes a great, I don't know, do I want to say great deal? He writes about this. So he'd been writing for a newspaper in Mexico City throughout the spring, and then as he goes to the Sierra, he continues to write these articles, which would be published on kind of a weekly basis. As he returns to civilization in the next few weeks, he'll have a series of 4 more articles about this thing, about what he experiences there. He participates in some indigenous rite, which people who have studied it most closely argue was actually a funeral rite at which people may have taken peyote. He may have taken peyote at this time. But it was almost certainly not an actual peyote rite. And that's, maybe this doesn't mean anything, maybe it means a great deal. I think it's a thing that we have to think about. In any case, it's a shattering experience for him, mentally. And there's sort of, this is another one of these kind of core topics that we need to think about when we're thinking about this journey. Part of it is is this notion of the indigenous. You know, he's trying to get outside of European civilization. He's turning to an indigenous civilization. How does one do that? And we could use the word decolonization if we want to, you know, put a big word on it right now. Like, who has the right to speak of these things? What is it to participate in them? And then, you know, what is the preparation that we need to have for that kind of thing? Ultimately, what Artaud did was experience a moment of profoundly altered state of consciousness. He did participate in some form of right, which was part of the shattering that he experienced. He traveled to this place that was suffused with meaning. The essay that he writes about it is called The Mountain of Signs, and it has to do with his traveling through a canyon of stones that are shaped in a richly meaningful way. So he sees human beings in stone. He sees all kinds of things. And here, you know, we read the essays like this Mountain of Signs essay. We read it somewhat, you know, retrospectively, and we think he's a madman. You know, this is a man who will be institutionalized within a year. He's paranoid. You know, he's projecting. But if you travel to a region like that and you see those stones, you see that they are shaped in a very profound way, and that we can see things like this. I've written a bit also about painted caves and petroglyphs. And so that valley, the Mountain of Signs Valley that Artaud traveled through, is a valley filled with petroglyphs. It is a valley where people went to encounter the wild in stone, to be in a different kind of environment certainly than Mexico City. So there's a lot to sort of grapple with within that. But Artaud, already in a fragile state of mind, has his experience tested to its limits in that. And he, you know, participates in this funeral rite, and within a couple of weeks is headed back to Mexico City.
But isn't that what he wanted?
Yeah.
Isn't that why he went there?
Yeah, and so that too is another kind of an enormous question. This is why he seems to have gone there. And as I was saying earlier, it's not absolutely clear that he, you know, went all the way to Mexico for this purpose. Retrospectively, we think of it that way. We think, oh yeah. And there's even more to say about that. You know, when some of these materials were collected and published, translated into English the first time around, the book or that section of the book, the writing about the Tarahumara, in France, the book is simply called the Tarahumara. In English, when it was first translated, it was called the Peyote Dance. So,
do we know if you had any experience with hallucinogens before this?
There's nothing to suggest that he did.
So it's going to be a bit of a trip.
Yeah. Well, and that's another thing to say about this too, right? He's a lifelong opium addict, right? And so opium is a very different type of drug than hallucinogen, right? It's not opium is a sedative. It's a thing that one takes to take one down. Yeah, it's the other direction.
If you keep lots of it, you can go into a trip out as well.
Yes, but it's a different kind of thing than a psychedelic. You know, when we think about, you know, Michael Pollan, who writes about drugs, has a good way of classifying these things, where he says that, you know, that there are downers, there are uppers, and there are outers, and we trip out on the psychedelics. So it's a very different kind of thing than what Artaud had been doing with himself, to his body, all along. You know, was he drawn to the psychedelic experience as an alternative to the opiate experience? It wasn't the same thing. It is something that is absolutely certain. But it's also not something that he then is in any condition to return to. And as you say, it's like he got there, he did this thing, and then he's done. I'm going back. And so it's extremely, it's a strange thing. He immediately starts writing about it. He mails the first 2 articles that he writes. He mails them from Chihuahua back to Mexico City. He's so eager to have some money from this, because the newspaper articles are the only way that he can pay his way. And he's telling this story to a certain extent, but already at that moment, before he's even out of the mountains, the experience is being wrapped up in fable. It's clear that he'd done a bunch of research prior to going. He'd read some things. It's unclear when he read anthropologists writing about the peyote dance, but at some point he did, because his writings about the peyote dance bear remarkable similarity to published writings by anthropologists who wrote about it. And when I say remarkable similarity, I mean like plagiarism. He is following the structure of paragraphs, the order of ideas that you can find in other writings about this.
Was that an attempt to suggest that he had experienced that peyote dance himself?
That's what it would seem.
Yeah.
Yes. So he participated in what was most likely a funeral rite, and instead he took it up a notch. He said, "No, this is the thing I'm describing." On the other hand, it could be that he didn't read a description of the funeral rite. He read descriptions of the peyote dance and just like, okay, well, this is what I'm going to write about. Nevertheless, it elevates the story. And the story itself is what kind of gains momentum in his experience of it. So it's a very strange moment in like Artaud's life and experience, and then retrospectively, here we are talking about it all these years later, 90 years later, thinking about all these things and what they may or may not mean, and like partly when I'm reading these materials, I'm thinking, how quickly we go to, the peyote dance narrative, how quickly we put it in that sort of a box, even though Artaud himself was searching for something else. He was looking for a different kind of experience, a connection with a place, with soil, with sun, with culture, a different way of living. That's the substance of what he was looking for, and it got caught up in all these other things, and it became a different story that caught on in culture, kind of decades later. In any case, he had that moment and returned to Mexico City, and very quickly returns to France and starts trying to publish his writings about the Tarahumara. He gets some pushback because of various qualities of the writing, the kind of occult sensibility that he is bringing to it, which his intellectual friends in Paris don't appreciate. Jean Paulin, his supporter, it's like, he dialed it down, it seems. He kind of writes through these things and eventually publishes a few articles in Paris that are the kind of the culmination, the core of it, and these become known as the Journey to the Land of the Tarahumara, which takes on a life of its own in terms of Artaud's writing. But he had all this other stuff that he lost. He dreamed of putting together a book about Mexican indigenous civilization. The manuscripts get lost back in Mexico. The dream kind of evaporates. He continues his search, though. Spring 1937, so the following year. Mexico seems to have been a failure to him, even though he's still pushing the idea. So he conceives of a new trip closer to home. He's going to go to Ireland. And the idea here is that it's a little bit closer to home. These are
It's Staple Island.
He can speak the language. Kind of. Yeah. Kind of. It's closer. It's certainly closer. It's on Europe. It's Europe effectively. It's
speak Spanish in Mexico. That's European as well. The Germans and the French have been in Mexico for years.
For
You
years.
probably speak German, so but many Mexicans speak French or German.
It's possible. It's possible. It's in Mexico City. It's understandable how Artaud could get around speaking.
Of course,
Yeah. That's not a big deal. He gave lectures that were well attended in French rather than in Spanish. So his French would be fine in Mexico City. It's up in the mountains.
Yeah, of course,
Yeah, the things become a little bit more.
Well, the indigenous people that speak Spanish difference for their language. So.
That's right. So you need to translate that goes across those barriers, definitely. In any case, his Irish sojourn is even more problematic. At that point, he believes that he's been given a staff, a walking stick that he believes is the cane of St. Patrick that he needs to return to the Irish people. So, he went from a person in search of a kind of a meaning that he could find in solid things. He wanted the world to be filled with value and meaning. And by the spring of 1937, he's seeing things as meaningful in clearly unhinged and unhealthy ways. Perceiving this cane of St. Patrick as the genuine cane of St. Patrick. Unfortunate. He goes to Ireland. He goes as far as to the Aran Islands. So it's a similar gesture. He's trying to get underneath Christian civilization in Ireland. But he has no money, and he's not well. He skips out on his hotel bills. He is a problematic nuisance in public. He eventually gets himself deported.
I think he's involved in a number of scenes in Dublin, isn't he?
He's involved in a number of scenes in Dublin. Yes, he is.
Scenes.
Yes.
In those sort of animistic cultures, they would believe in the potency of an object, but in our culture we
Do not.
don't. So
That's
so
exactly it.
he got that.
Yes.
Got that with him.
That's it.
That ability.
He writes about it in the essays. He says, "I am seeking, animistic culture. I'm seeking to get underneath totemism."
Yeah,
So he's read anthropology. He understands what totemism is. He wants to get underneath that, and he achieves that. But unfortunately, that is in a completely altered state of consciousness from modern consciousness. So again, is this success? Is this failure? It's shattering for him. In any case, so he's deported from Ireland, and he believes that he's attacked on the boat back to France. He has no money. He is starting scenes. He's attacked on the boat. Maybe they came in to make him be quiet. Who knows? Again, there's speculation about this, but this begins a period of 8 years and 8 months of internment in mental asylums in France.
It may be worth just mentioning that Artaud's methods of communication, poetically and theatrically, could often include screaming and shouting
Yes.
and banging things repeatedly for like long periods of time. So it would be no surprise if the crew on the ship wanted to shut it
down.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
So quite possibly they came in just to ask him to calm it down, and there was a altercation, and he lands back in France in a straitjacket, I think.
He does. But building on some of those remarks, Artaud wanted to shift the theater. Years before that, he wanted to shift the theater away from an emphasis on the spoken word, on the text, towards something that involves a greater emphasis on gesture. So, in his as the years pass, he becomes obsessed with gestures as a way to fight off the demons that he believes are attacking him. So there's a lot to say about that kind of thing. Nevertheless, he spends his 8 years and 8 months in asylums. He has electroshock therapy in 1944, and the Mexico material stays with him and stays with kind of his readers throughout this this period. He stops writing. He changes his name, and he eventually comes back to being Antonin Artaud in 1944, and he's able, through the help of friends, to not quite leave. Well, he leaves the condition of involuntary internment, and he lives on the grounds of an asylum in the final years of his life. But what he's doing at that moment, and here I'm trying to kind of close down on some of this, what he's doing in that final moment is sifting through his life and work, and this Mexico material, this Mexico experience remains extremely significant to him and to the readers. Some publishers write to him and say, hey, those articles you published about the Tarahumara, let's put that out as a book. Do you want to write some new material for that? And so he does. It becomes a kind of cornerstone of his work in this final period, which is a absolutely explosive and a volcanic amount of writing. He fills these student notebooks with writing that he's writing essentially constantly. He has a series of final performances, and he has an exhibition of his drawings. He does a radio show called Ted Dunn with the Judgment of God, which has as one of its sort of panels a section which is about the Tarahumara. So he's continuing to write about his experiences in Mexico, to write through it, to reflect on it, to return to it in certain ways. And there's again, one of the ironies of this material, perhaps the most thorough and complete description of what he may or may not have experienced there is in the final piece, the one that is not the absolute final, but one of the last pieces that he writes about this experience. So he's got the most details, somehow 10 years later, after spending all that time in a mental institution. Hardly likely. The mind does not gain clarity after those kinds of experiences. Nevertheless, it's a central moment in his life, and I think it's filled with a lot of questions that are, to me, they're I'll say increasingly relevant. And there's a bunch to say about this. So the legacy of this is strange. As I said, Artaud continued to write about it. People continued to publish his books. Those writings that he had published in Mexico essentially vanished, but in the 1960s, some researchers there collected them. They went through all the newspapers and said, oh, this is by Artaud. And they published a book of those in 1962 in Spanish. So that material then got translated into French in the 1960s and 70s. Some of it got translated into English. Thereafter, there are editions in German. There's a kind of complete edition in Spanish as well. So it's like a generation later, our appreciation of Artaud in Mexico expands.
Actually,
Yeah.
Life magazine actually sent 2 journalists down there in the 60s to actually document exactly a similar thing, a peyote trip, which they did with photographs.
Oh, yes.
And they published it, and then the consequence of that was that a lot of it wasn't fully the hippie culture then, but that opened up the doorway to the tripping culture.
It really did.
Obviously, he was the predecessor.
He did. Yeah, and so this is a thing that I was going to say. So
That was part of the legacy, I guess.
it's absolutely part of the legacy. So in the United
For
States,
100 years before 1960, the Northern birds in Germany, there was massive movements of sort of anti-industrialization, so people going to Mexico for years, all across Europe.
Yeah.
It was a huge thing, They all went to do mezcal.
Yeah, it's quite a strange thing. So, like D.H. Lawrence had gone to Mexico seeking those things. One of his books, called Mornings in Mexico, is translated into French and appeared in the fall of 1935. This is
Malcolm Lowry, Under the Volcano.
Much
He
later.
was another guy who went to Mexico and literally lost his mind.
But so the Beat generation in the United States, the Beat generation, William S. Burroughs went to Mexico, lived in Mexico City, and had tragic events there himself. But the publishing sort of wing of the Beat generation, if we want to call it that, City Lights Books, they published a very successful Artaud anthology, as it's called, a collection of writings by Artaud, and that book really emphasized, in a lot of ways, the kind of view of Artaud as the drug addict and the outsider, the madman. It's one kind of reading of Artaud, and that's again this part of what is interesting to me about this. Artaud went to Mexico to change culture, to think about a different way of living, but it got co-opted into a kind of a drug culture, which is not to say that is not another way of living or access to altered states of consciousness, because it certainly is. But there's a larger picture, and Artaud was interested in that type of a picture as well. But now, as you're saying, there's a kind of a return to some of these things. In the past, generation, we've had different ways of engaging with this Artaud material. Wolfgang Rehm did an opera called The Conquest of Mexico, which is based on Artaud's texts. There's a graphic novel, a bande dessinée in France, called L'Esprit Rouge, which is about Artaud's trip to Mexico. The Sound Collective and Patti Smith did a album of music that includes Tarahumara, recordings, and Artaud's texts. So it's a thing that has spread very widely, even though not necessarily evenly and not necessarily fully in terms of what it was about for Artaud. And then sort of to close with this part of what you were saying a second ago, they built an airport near there within the last decade. Because
in Mexico?
Yeah, because people are interested in filming.
The direct trip.
For the direct trip. Exactly. So,
well, they've timed that right. It's all open up again, isn't it? The psychedelic.
It seems to be. It seems to be. So quite strange, right? Artaud went on this journey that was extremely difficult and ultimately shattering for him, and now we can fly there much more easily. So, was Artaud interested in the kind of touristic approach to this place and the kind of experiences that we can have there? How much access should we have? These are obviously questions, right? Should that be the way that we approach it? Should we have to go so far away to find the kind of connection that he was seeking? I don't have answers to any of those questions, but those are, I think, very interesting questions that we get.
Maybe you've got to be indigenous to have the full indigenous experience. It's like Western Europeans going to Africa, South America, and expecting to have some sort of, maybe they do have a shamanic experience, I don't know, but that will never be the same. If you're indigenous, you're going to have
a different kind of thing.
It's going to have more cultural sort of backup to sort of fall upon, isn't it?
You could have gone into rural France, couldn't you?
Could have gone to the
You
Pyrenees.
could have gone into rural France and take the special, you were still living like what you were talking about Hanshe was Austria, pre.
Yeah, it does.
Search for a rootsy.
There's areas of France that are pretty well, like Canard and places like that, it had their own real societies, Breton, places like that, So
Yeah,
there are.
like in the,
But he didn't want that, he wanted to
100
experience
years
something
ago.
more exotic, I guess, as we all did.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a real challenging question though. Like sometimes we do have to go on that trip. We have to get far away to get outside of ourselves. You know, like doing it in our own homes. So for the if you're a member of the Native American Church, you know, even this kind of a conversation about the thing, it would be, you know, arguably offensive, because peyote for the Native American Church is a sacrament. It's a sacred plant. So it's not even a thing that, like, to participate in those rites as a non-member is a, you know, arguably offensive thing to do. So, and that too, it's like, how did Artaud, total outsider, drug addict, not quite all there, how did he manage to get himself able to participate in a thing? Would that be possible now? It's hard to say. D.H. Lawrence in his book Mornings in Mexico, you know, he describes seeing some rituals in the American Southwest. In, you know, he lived in Taos, New Mexico, and then also in Mexico. But he describes everybody pulling up in their cars to come and watch this kind of Native American dance. That's very much tourism. That's not participation. That's watching rather than living. Artaud in the book writes about the problems with anthropology and being an objective observer. Objectivity is part of the culture that he wants to get out of. It's part of Western civilization. He wants to get into a kind of a way of living that is deeper than that. Artaud is also not interested in the subjective, the psychological, the ego. It's not about my trip. It's about our trip for him. So, you know, how do we transcend the objective and the subjective? How do we have it not just be tourism? There are a lot of questions.
See, I learned just a small bit about Artaud, but he often seemed to have incredible objectives with the things he did with his theatre. He wanted to kind of tear society in two.
Absolutely.
Trip to Mexico was going to change the cosmos. He's probably setting himself up to fail a little bit. Is this a cycle of situations that he found himself in of disappointment?
I think that's fair to say. That's part of the
Not being human, isn't it?
yeah. But I mean, on the scale of it,
Yeah, but then you had Hitler. He did change, though, you know, everything, didn't he? So if you, in that respect,
And
someone,
Stalin.
do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not him alone, but
Yeah.
Stalin and, you know,
Yeah.
Pol Pot and all.
Uh-huh.
So why not an artist have that level of power, you know, or that impetus to have that amount of, you know, to change culture?
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
his job, isn't it? That's what he needs to.
Mm-hmm.
I think it makes sense. What you're talking about, his impetus for genuine change in the face of such polarity, you know, such dramatic political
You're right.
state. What else could you do at that point in history as an artist who believed in anything that they were doing?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that or
The scale
You know,
and
it's nothing,
scope of it,
really.
the
Yeah.
tremendous ambition of it is just extraordinary.
yeah.
And but you know, like
Yeah.
how much should we hope for? Could we hope for? You know, I read. I mean, I think I spend too much time reading figures like this, but it is humbling. There's a guy called Wes Jackson in the United States who writes about agriculture, and he says any problem that you can solve within your lifetime is too small a problem. You know, so think big. Think about generational change. Think about changing the way that we live for generations to come. And Artaud was thinking on that scale, but he wanted it now, which is very much a modernist type of thing. You know, have we lost that ambition? I don't.
But did he glimpse it, like, because he would have been born in what, 1900s or what year?
He was born in 1896.
So he was truly a child of a previous sort of way of living. In a way, he almost, we're very industrialised. We don't really, even though we're perhaps children of Victorians, we don't have as much access. But he would have had access to maybe a different way. Do you think, or not?
Well, he has certainly had
His grandparents or his, his extended family
Mhm.
may have had a more earth, sun, connected way
of
living.
seeing things.
Seeing the world. Do you think that's a bit?
I don't think in Artaud's case, he's from Marseille, and his family is from sort of the Eastern Mediterranean. So he comes from this kind of Mediterranean culture. He grew up in a household where many languages were spoken. So he's a kind of a Mediterranean cosmopolitan figure in that way, but he's nevertheless interested in getting beneath contemporary civilization. It's a modernist story, but the scale and scope of it is still extraordinary, and then his tremendous energy. So the fact that he failed repeatedly on such a spectacular scale is
He kept trying, though, right?
he kept trying different kinds of things, and he kept failing right up into the very end of his life. His radio program, To Have Done with the Judgment of God, recorded in 1947, and then banned, right on the eve of broadcast. So it's like even in the weeks right before Artaud dies, he's still failing at a spectacular level and admitting his own failure, which is another thing in reading about him. He makes this final gesture, this radio program, and it gets banned, and all that is extremely disappointing to him, but he nevertheless admits that it was a failure. that thing, because it's recorded, because it's the machine, because it's modern technology, cannot do what he hoped it would do. He tried, he failed, it got banned anyway.
Maybe he succeeded in one way, and that was still him being able to talk about it. And so I suppose it is what is left is something for people to think about and consider, and that has probably influenced future generations.
Massively.
But I'm not saying like in a big way, but probably at least made people inquire about it and sort of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it has in a big way because of his impact on the theater and on poetry in multiple languages. The forcefulness with which he writes and bringing that sort of forcefulness into poetry. We can think about all these legacies across the arts. The fact that we're sitting here, 90 years after this journey to Mexico, talking about it, far away from it. This legacy is very much living, and I mentioned some of the sort of tendrils of it. It's absolutely a living legacy. The part of one thing that interests me here is there's this phrase, no more masterpieces, or to be done with masterpieces, that comes from a manifesto of his that's in the theater, and it's double. He doesn't want there to be masterpieces, the kind of a project that we revere for all time. He thinks that the moment must live, that we only live in the moment. It's a sort of existential idea, but he's interested in those kind of the connections that we have in moments rather than reverence. So one thing to think about with Artaud is that we don't want to, we don't want to turn him into a masterpiece, because he's not a masterpiece. His work is not a masterpiece or a series of masterpieces. It's extraordinary in terms of its reach, range, and power, but it's not a collection of masterpieces. It's a collection of failures. Spectacular failures, instructive failures, but failures nonetheless. And so we can learn a lot from the failures, but they're not masterpieces. It's not the final answer. And so revering Artaud, even respecting Artaud to a certain extent, might have us on the wrong track. And that's another thing that I think is really interesting about reading. Like, how do we, part of what I'm trying to do in this project is have him be this open site where we can ask a bunch of questions.
There's only one way you can do it, and you'll have to retrace his footpath.
Yeah.
Let me go there. And do
Some
it.
people, they have. There's a book
But
of.
even
Come back
then,
with your cane.
Came back on the cane. Yeah, I'm going to Ireland after this.
It seems to me like it's
they
a
come back
push.
with your part.
It's like a push towards intuition in the face of a horrible, crushing, pathological sort of bureaucracy like Nazism, death camps, and all of that. And it's like a lean towards an intuitive way of living, but not really understanding how
To shape it.
how to shape that and where that and what that is, and not understanding that culture's like biological. You're shaped by your culture, even physically, aren't you? Like your palate
Mm-hmm.
is shaped by the language you grew up speaking. You know, all sorts of things were embodied in you.
Right,
So
right.
you can't, if you really try and escape your own culture, you do either never come back, you don't come back, or you go to the madhouse. You know, because you don't make sense anymore, do you?
Yeah. Well, it's a constant negotiation,
Yeah.
I think. And it does seem like Artaud tried to do something other than negotiate.
Yeah.
He tried a much bigger gesture than that kind of, the micro politics, to take a kind of
Sounds a bit of a
philosophical
toddler to me, like a tantrum.
A
Yeah.
series of them.
Yeah, that sort of demonstrative, as you say, it's clanking loads of sounds on the boat and feeling like really disappointed and then thinking I'll do something really wildly
Either or.
different and find my new identity somehow in this idea.
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, there is a kind of a tantrum quality to each of these gestures.
Do you know what it was like to be around? People, obviously he changed, it sounds like, but did people like his company or?
It does seem like
Just
that.
really.
So he's a man of tremendous information and energy, and so that can be compelling.
Yeah.
It
sounds like a very serious.
Yeah, absolutely serious person. So there are many kind of conflicting, views of this, and as you say, he also obviously changed. So he's the kind of guy that falls in with and inspires groups of people, but he's also a person that's tremendously isolated, and so we can see him, kind of moving from one group to another. He goes into he's part of a theater group and then alienates himself from that, and then he's part of the Surrealist group, and they argue about a certain, they argue over the notion of revolution, and it turns out that Artaud's view of that was the view that Andre Breton would later take on his own, So he's a guy that inspires other people, but he's also tremendously difficult, and tremendously sensitive. To use kind of contemporary parlance, he's a highly sensitive individual, difficult to be around.
I think he fell out with Breton many times, I think, but Breton funded or continued to support him
When he
throughout
could.
the rest of his life when he was able to do that, right?
Well, so particularly at a key moment, when Artaud comes back from Mexico, 1937, Breton helps him a bit right then, before the Ireland debacle. After World War II, when Artaud is released from Rodez, the asylum, they have a sale of donated manuscripts and paintings, and the Surrealists at that point help. So Artaud doesn't quite need financial support at that time. He's got enough money from that sale to help him along. But yeah, so he has this powerful and strange relationship with Andre Breton. That's contentious at times, but admiring each to the other. Artaud comes back from Mexico, meets with Breton. Breton helps him out, and is so inspired by what Artaud says about Mexico that Andre Breton goes to Mexico. So he's a guy that is doing that at that moment. But in the 1937 spring of 1937, he's absolutely euphoric, and so we have a lot of accounts of this moment and how he was. He's absolutely euphoric, and yet he's also tremendously difficult and shouting at people in the street. So, I mean, this kind of makes sense in terms of his, the degradation of his mental state. He gets engaged to a woman who's also an addict that spring, extremely unstable. So he goes back and forth in this way. But how do we want them to be? A figure like this.
So it reminds me from the Greek philosophers who was always naked and lived in a barrel and stung people. What's that?
That was named like these children, apparently.
And we still, his philosophy or his ideas, we still are in common. I can't think who it is. I don't know, my son always talks about
That's
that.
right. That is exactly.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
it's like that, isn't it? But, or at least I'm picturing that, but interesting.
Well, to me, Artaud is a fascinating figure because he's so extreme and so powerful and touched upon so many of these elements. There's just a lot to think about. There's a lot to consider in his case, and I wouldn't wish his life on anyone else, obviously, even fragments of it, probably. But from that, we can consider some of these elements and ask ourselves questions. I think about, the far from home question is a powerful one to me. How far do we need to travel to learn how to live here? To learn how to be local.
And how much energy? I mean, because there's a helplessness in current situations in terms of environmental situations and war situations, and we are sort of bombarded with imagery and bad news, and there's a general feeling of helplessness, or how do you help, or what do you do? And it feels quite relatable, doesn't it, to that period where he decided to go to Mexico, and it feels.
That's why I thought this project was so timely right now.
Yeah.
He's at the core of this project. He's thinking about the relationship between individuals, culture, and the earth. As the earth is in this cosmos. And that's what we're thinking about now in terms of climate change and ecological consciousness. Artaud goes to Mexico with an ecological vision about the relationship between these things and how do we live? What sort of a culture do we need? And these are questions that we could be asking ourselves, and many people are asking right now. And he's asking it in the deepest possible way. He's asking it, not simply just through the vein of science and objectivity and, what sort of, electric car is going to solve all our problems. But how do we live? How do we create meaning in a way that relates to the earth?
And there's an instinct that at one time we perhaps were able to. That's why he's going searching for ancient culture, isn't he? It's not true. We're never able to.
Yeah, that's another element that's sad. That human beings have degraded their environment wherever they have been. So going far from home is ultimately not going to be the solution that we need. But learning to be local will.
It was interesting. We've just been through a pandemic and we were forced to be at home. It wasn't so bad. for it was bad for some people. And then that's what the proportion and the levels of badness. But certain things was definitely an improvement. Nothing in the skies, and some people live in villages where there's cars go through all the time and just have their community. I don't know. I certainly slowed down a lot. Looked around just where I was, connected with the neighbours, and walked locally, felt connected with nature, and those stories are all over, aren't they? That people felt much more connected with nature, and nature came in to our world a bit more.
Dolphins are swimming around the tails or something.
Yeah,
Did that happen?
there was loads of stuff from nature coming in.
Yeah, it sort of felt like things like that happened.
Yeah. Some of the nice things that came out of that, the changing our relationship to work and the commute.
It's a bit of an opportunity. It was just like, when you started hearing the sounds again, and it's like, can we not change things right now? Because it was quite a time, wasn't it, when everything could have just gone right. Reset. Well, actually, there was a conspiracy theory about reset.
Yeah.
I can't quite remember. Yeah.
Not really a conspiracy, they were talking openly about it. The economic forum and people like that were talking openly about it, just to ensure there many of the sort of like leaders of the world were talking about, you know, this is the opportunity to reset, renew, change things. Never for the better, is it?
Right.
From my experience anyway, never.
Thanks, Stuart. So we got an opportunity for any last insightful, meaningful, deep questions.
How did you initially take up this?
How did I find
this
myself
idea of the book?
of this project?
Did something else lead you there, or did you just discover them somehow?
Well, many years ago, obviously, I got into all these kinds of these figures, and just found Artaud in particular to be such a rich area of inquiry. And then I translate a lot of books from French to English, and I like to edit things together and create new conversations with those types of materials. And so it's astonishing to me that this collection of work had not been brought into English in any full way before. Artaud is so well known. He's been in the museums and galleries. He's been such a force in the theater, the films. He's so well known, and yet he is appreciated in this way by this group, and this way by that group, and this way over here. Whereas this material about the journey to Mexico is a chapter that is a really, really significant chapter, and it's particularly significant because it's about his interest in changing culture, and so it stayed with me in that regard. And then hopefully you'll get a chance to look at the book. As I said, in French, it appears as several separate volumes. So there's a book of the writings from Mexico, all the things he published in the newspapers and the lectures and all that kind of stuff, called Revolutionary Messages. Then there's a book about the Tarahumara, which is those kinds of things, and those bits. And then we have a bunch of his letters and other things and other stray bits that he wrote before going. So even in French, you see it as separate parts. So this is the only publication that has all of it together. Even the German edition is just Revolutionary Messages and the Tarahumara and some of the letters. It doesn't include the full story, the full range of it. If we have the full range of it, it raises a lot more questions than any one of those individual chapters do. And so that's the point of this project, is to bring it all together, and that raises more questions than it answers, but I think that's more productive.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stuart.
Well, you're welcome.
Absolutely great.